The first movie ever made wasn't about love, it wasn't about war. It was about a woman pulling babies out of a cabbage patch, and the reason why will change how you see the last 800 years of history. What you are looking at is real footage. A woman dressed in a Victorian corset standing inside a hand-painted garden. She reaches behind an enormous cabbage. She pulls out a living infant. She places it on the ground the way you would set down a head of lettuce. Then she reaches behind the cabbage again and pulls out another one. This film was shot in 1900. It is the oldest surviving narrative film on Earth. The woman performing the role of the fairy is Yvonne McNeil-Sarand. The person behind the camera is Alice Guy-Blaché. And the question nobody has ever properly asked is this: out of every story that could have launched the art of cinema, why was this the one? Paris, February 1896. A 22-year-old woman named Alice Guy is walking along the Boulevard du Temple. She is on her way somewhere else entirely when a storefront window stops her. The lights inside are on. She steps in. Along the walls are rows of glass and metal boxes, and inside those boxes are living human babies, premature infants, some of them small enough to rest in a single palm. They are lying in machines built on the same mechanical principle as chicken egg incubators, because that is precisely what they are. The man who built them, an engineer named Alexander Lyon, filed his patent on October 28, 1889. He modeled the device on poultry equipment. He funded the whole operation by selling tickets to the public to come and watch newborns survive. 50,000 people paid admission in the first year alone. Alice Guy was among them. Her granddaughter, Renee Blaché Bolton, confirmed this years later. Alice walked into that storefront, watched infants displayed inside glass boxes for a paying crowd, and 3 months afterward, she directed the first narrative film ever recorded, a fairy harvesting babies from a cabbage patch. The promotional poster for Lyon's exhibition makes the connection almost impossible to miss. Designed by Adolfo Hohenstein, it shows a nurse cradling 3 infants. Behind her, climbing vines sprout baby heads instead of flowers. Illustrations of children growing like botanical specimens run across the entire background. This poster was hung on the streets of Paris in 1996. Children depicted not as born, but as grown. That visual language was already living on a Paris boulevard before the postcards existed, before the dolls, before any of what comes next. And here is where most people who have covered this topic begin: the postcards. Between 1900 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of postcards spread across Europe and North America, all showing the same thing: babies emerging from cabbage patches, babies pulled from the earth like root vegetables, babies tended by gardeners and presented to couples who browse the rows the way shoppers browse a market stall. These postcards were not the product of one company running a coordinated campaign. They came from dozens of independent studios operating across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States. Multiple languages, completely different artistic styles, no documented central organizing source. Art history class files them as whimsical birth announcements, sentimental folk imagery, harmless. And they are not entirely wrong. In France, children had been told for centuries that boys grow in cabbage patches and girls grow in rose bushes. French parents still call their children mon petit chou, my little cabbage. In Scotland, children placed cabbage leaves on the doorstep to invite the fairies to bring a sibling. In Ireland, children were told they had been found beneath a cabbage stalk. The folklore is genuinely old and genuinely widespread. I want to address this directly. It is entirely possible the postcards are exactly what the historians say they are: birth announcements, folk tradition, charming and innocent and disconnected from anything darker. If that were the complete picture, I would take that explanation and move forward. But the timeline will not stay innocent, because during the exact decades those postcards were circulating, between 1900 and 1920, the single largest mass movement of children in American history was actively underway, and the scale of it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. September 20, 1854.
A train departs New York City. It is carrying 46 children, ranging from infants to 12 years old. No parents are aboard. No family is waiting at the destination. When the train arrives in Dowagiac, Michigan, the children are lined up along the railway platform. Local families walk down the line. They look the children over. They choose which ones to take home. That is the first orphan train. The last one departs on May 31, 1929, carrying 3 children to Sulphur Springs, Texas. By that point, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children will have been transported this way. At peak volume, 3,000 to 4,000 children per year were being shipped westward. The first program agent allowed families to take boys home without any reference checks. He openly told crowds that boys were useful for work and girls could handle all varieties of housekeeping. Many of these children ended up as farm labor. Many of them were not orphans at all. They were the children of immigrants, the children of poor families. The program's own co-founders eventually acknowledged this. The children rode for days in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes in rail cars not meaningfully different from livestock transport. 2 or 3 adult chaperones managed 30 to 40 children at a time. When the children arrived, they carried no birth certificates, no verified family histories, no provable identity. An estimated 2 million living descendants today still cannot trace their lineage past the platform where they were selected. Where did they come from? The cabbage patch. That was the answer the culture constructed. Not in a literal sense, but in a functional one. The mythology performed the same social work as a deliberate silence, and the orphan trains were the American chapter of this story. Across the Atlantic, the system was older and ran at far greater scale. The foundling wheel, called the riota in Italy, was a rotating wooden cylinder built directly into the exterior wall of a hospital or church. A woman could place her infant inside, ring a small bell, and the staff on the other side would turn the wheel to receive the child. Anonymous, no questions, no record of the parent. The first one was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 1400s, they had spread throughout Catholic Europe. By the 1800s, the numbers become almost impossible to absorb. Over 100,000 infants abandoned annually across the continent. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in cities was left in these institutions. France alone operated 251 foundling wheels at their peak, formally legalized on January 19, 1811. The mortality rate inside these foundling hospitals averaged 80%. In some years, it reached 100. Children who survived were renamed. In Italy, they were called esposti, the exposed ones. In Milan, they were named Colombo, like the pigeons nesting outside the foundling home. In France, they were called trouvé, the found. Mothers sometimes tucked a token inside the wheel with their child, a ribbon, a coin, a torn piece of cloth, a way to find them again someday. Most never came back. Hold the full timeline in your mind.
1198, the first foundling wheel is installed in Rome. By the 1700s, boys from cabbages and girls from roses is the standard explanation given to children throughout France. 1811, France formally legalizes 251 foundling wheels. 1854, the first orphan train leaves New York. 1863, France begins shutting its foundling wheels down. 1869, Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon places a cradle on a Manhattan doorstep to receive abandoned infants, establishing the New York Foundling Hospital. 1889, Alexandre Lyon patents his infant incubator modeled on poultry equipment. February 1896, Alice Guy-Blaché walks into Lyon's incubator exhibition on the boulevard and stands in front of babies displayed in glass boxes for a paying public. Spring 1896, she films La Fée aux Choux. The first narrative film in the history of cinema is about harvesting babies from a garden. That same year, incubator infants are exhibited at the Berlin Exposition under the name Kinderbrutanstalt. That word translates to child hatchery. 1900 to 1920, cabbage baby postcards flood the Western world.
1903, Martin Cooney opens his permanent incubator exhibit at Coney Island, displaying premature infants alongside sword swallowers and sideshow performers. He charges 25 cents admission. He operates the exhibit for 40 consecutive years. Each element connects to the one before it. Each decade adds another layer, and every layer uses the same vocabulary. Children as things that are cultivated, harvested, put on display, selected, and redistributed. Not born into families, delivered to them, by fairies, by gardeners, by institutions that have agreed not to say plainly what they are doing. I want to be transparent about something. I sat with this research for nearly a week before I began writing, not because the facts were difficult to locate. They are well documented. The orphan trains have a PBS documentary. The foundling wheels appear in peer-reviewed medical journals. Alice Guy-Blaché's visit to the incubator exhibition is confirmed by her own granddaughter. The difficulty was not finding evidence. The difficulty was that every time I arranged the timeline, I could already hear the objection that I was manufacturing a pattern from unrelated events. I kept interrogating myself. Is that true? Is folklore just folklore? Is a postcard just a postcard? Is the fact that all of this clusters across the same decades and the same countries simply what large-scale coincidence looks like? Then I found what Salvador Dalí said about the postcards. Dalí collected them. So did André Breton. So did Paul Éluard, who described them as a Lilliputian hallucination of the world. Dalí called them the most vivid document of popular modern thought, a thought so profound or so precise that it escapes psychoanalysis entirely. The surrealists were not collecting them as charming novelties. They were collecting them because they recognized something in the imagery that resisted comfortable explanation. A British art dealer named James Birch began collecting them in Aix-en-Provence. He later discovered an entire display case of them at the Pompidou Center, exhibited specifically for their influence on the Dadaists and Surrealists. He published a book about them in 2010 called Babylon's Surreal Babies. Even the art world understood these postcards were carrying something heavier than sentiment. And the postcards themselves were not gentle. Some of them show babies being sold. Some reference child lotteries. Some show gardeners tending rows of infants while couples walk along pointing at them. The imagery is transactional, commercial. It mirrors the mechanics of the foundling system and the orphan trains with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Babies emerge from the earth with no parents, no origin, no history. Someone selects one. Someone carries it home. That is not what a birth announcement looks like. That is what displacement looks like when an entire culture has quietly agreed to call it something else. The medical establishment of this period makes the picture considerably darker. Martin Cooney, who operated baby incubator exhibitions at Coney Island for 40 decades, almost certainly held no legitimate medical license. He fabricated his credentials because the actual medical profession had no interest in treating premature infants at all. A Chicago physician produced a film explicitly advocating for allowing them to die, labeled defectives, framed as a threat to the nation. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal questioned in 1901 whether saving premature infants was a worthwhile endeavor. The eugenics movement openly described them as weaklings who would degrade the population. In that environment, the only institution willing to save a premature baby was a sideshow exhibit. Cooney saved more than 6,500 lives this way. His nurse would slide a diamond ring up a baby's arm to the shoulder to show the audience how small the infants were. When Cooney died, his death certificate made no mention of medicine. Neither did Alexandre Lyon's. Lyon, the man whose invention directly inspired the first film ever made, was listed on his 1934 death certificate as a wandering salesman. 80 years after the postcards disappeared from circulation, the story returned. In 1976, a 21-year-old Georgia art student named Xavier Roberts encountered dolls at a craft fair. They had been made by a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas, who had been creating what she called doll babies since the early 1970s. Each one arrived with a birth certificate and adoption papers. No parents listed, born in a cabbage patch. Roberts bought her dolls, then began producing his own after Thomas refused to supply him further. He renamed them Little People. A licensing agent named Roger Schleifer renamed them Cabbage Patch Kids in 1982 and built the origin mythology around them. The official story held that Xavier Roberts, as a 10-year-old boy, had followed a magical creature behind a waterfall into a cabbage patch where babies were being born. Roberts sold them from a place he called Babyland General Hospital, a converted abandoned medical clinic in Georgia. He did not sell them, you adopted them. Each one arrived with a unique birth certificate and adoption papers. No parents listed, born in a cabbage patch. Martha Nelson Thomas sued Roberts. They settled out of court in 1985 for an undisclosed sum. Her name was removed from the product's history entirely. Colico mass-produced them beginning in 1983. 3 million sold by the end of that year, 20 million in 1984, $2 billion in retail sales. Adults physically fought one another in store aisles to adopt these dolls. Dolls with no parents, born from cabbages, distributed through a converted hospital. The entire operational logic of the foundling system compressed into a children's toy. And nobody recognized what the story was actually about because the story had been narrating itself for 800 years. Every civilization requires a narrative to describe what it cannot state directly. You do not tell a child that their sibling was placed inside a wooden box built into a church wall by a mother who could not feed them. You tell the child their sibling was found in the cabbage patch. You do not tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and transported across a continent. You send them postcards of babies growing in gardens, tended by fairies, delivered to warm and loving homes. The fairy tale performs the work of erasure. It always has. Alice Guy-Blaché stood in front of babies in glass boxes on a Paris boulevard and transformed what she witnessed into the first story cinema ever chose to tell. That story was about a fairy drawing children out of a garden. The original 1996 film is now lost. 90% of all films made before 1929 no longer exist. We preserved almost nothing from the moment cinema was born. The one film that might reveal what the culture was processing when it selected this story as its first one has vanished entirely. The postcards are in museum archives. The orphan train records are in genealogical databases. The foundling wheel mechanisms still sit embedded in old hospitals across Europe. The Cabbage Patch Kids are in attics and storage units across America, each one with its adoption certificate still folded inside. And somewhere between folklore and institutional record, between fairy tale and documented history, sits a question no one has properly asked. What story does a civilization construct when it needs to account for where all the children came from? What mythology does it build when the truth is too large, too systemic, too deeply uncomfortable for a direct answer? And when that mythology appears in the first film ever made, in the most widely circulated postcards of an era, and in the best-selling toy of the 20th century, all using the same image, babies without parents, harvested from a garden, what exactly are we looking at? A coincidence that spans 8 centuries and 6 continents? Or the longest-running cover story in West